So I'd like to welcome everyone to Stockbridge Library, Museum, and Archives online poetry series. We are actually in our third year of bringing virtual poetry readings to the community, which we're very proud of. This series was started by John Gillespie, who's with us here today. John, at the time, was the president of our board of trustees, and he brought his great love of poetry combined with his stroke of genius to start this program for us. John, thank you so much. We're so grateful and lucky. We are also grateful to have with us two wonderful poets, Peter Kline and Brittany Perham. Brittany's most recent book, Brittany's most recent book, sorry about that, my watch was speaking to me, was called Double Portrait. It came out in 2017 from Norton, and it was selected by Claudia Rankin for the Barnard Women Poets Prize and was also a finalist for the Northern California Book Award. She is also the author of The Curiosities and a collaborative chat book. She has received several awards, and she is a graduate of Stanford University Creative Writing Program, and she was a lecturer there, and she was a Wallace Stegner Fellow. And Peter Kline teaches at the University of San Francisco and also at Stanford. He too is a former Wallace Stegner Fellow and has received residency fellowships from the Amy Clampett House, which is here in the Berkshires, James Merrill House, Marble House Project, Art Smith, Orcas Island, and Kimmel Harding Nelson Foundation. Peter's poetry has appeared in Plowshares, Poetry, Tin House, as well as many other journals. And his first collection of poetry, Deviance, was published by Stephen F. Austin State University Press in 2013. So thank you both for joining us. And I'd like to turn the program over to you, John, and to our poets.
Oh, thanks, Wendy. I think everything talks to you nowadays. Your phone, your Outlook, the world of silence will be the next big app. It won't be an app, it'll just be a blank screen. No, thank you, Wendy and the Stockbridge Library for hosting the program. This is the start of our fourth year, although we're in the third season. So no, it's a great time to an hour to enjoy poetry and as I call it, have a poetry recharge. And Peter, I don't know if you know this, the program started with some of the Amy Clampett Fellows. As I was the interim CFO at Berkshire-Taconic Community Foundation, where the Clampett Fund is housed. So when I started it, I went to the person who was responsible and said, "Hey, let's dig up some poets." So no, I think we've had 6 or 7 people. So that's how the initial group of poets started. So let's start, and Brittany, we'll start with you. Peter probably has answers from like last year, so we'll start with no, I'm kidding. I know, too little sleep and too much coffee, I think. So Brittany, what does inquiry mean to you?
Well, in terms of poetry, I think a poem is always an inquiry. I think it has to be. I think if you start out to write the things that you're already certain of and the things that you already know, you're going to be bored and your reader's going to be bored. So I think a poem is always asking a question. I think that's the idea of it. That's why we do it. I think it's, as a poet, it's a very particular way to try to figure out something. And it could be something that you're trying to figure out conceptually. That's the book that, is most recent for me as a conceptual project. And so the poems are trying to figure out something across a whole book. But I think it can also be a way to figure out something about language, figure out something about the way you're feeling, figure out something about, the experiences that you've had. And so I think all poems have to be inquiries of a certain kind. They work fundamentally like, these little machines that ask something and then try to sort of turn on when the reader encounters them. So So, I mean, I think that's what is at the heart of poetry. I think it's a great question, John. I forget what last year, when I saw Peter's last reading, I forget what the topic was, but I like the idea of inquiry.
Yeah, last season was the refuge of witnessing.
Mhm.
And that was pretty intense. That was an intense year, but it was a great, because people played both concepts, one concept. So, but really, let me just have a follow-up question here. When you start your writing, are you starting with a question, or are you letting a question kind of arrive in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a process of both things. I don't really think that you sit down to write if you aren't sort of asking something or thinking about something or wanting to work something out. I mean, I think that there's something gets stuck in your head, a moment of language that you're like, oh, I have to sort of go toward that and see if I can like work into that and work through it. And you're trying to figure it out. So I think you sort of sit down with like these parameters of like, something's happening inside, right? Like something's happening with this like thing in my ear, or with this, maybe it's a sort of like feeling, it could be starting from a number of different places. And then I think as you get into the poem, the questions change as you follow the poem out and start to draft it and figure out what it wants to be. It has its own questions. And so your questions change. It might not be the thing that you started with. I think it's kind of, it works both ways.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So Peter, what does inquiry mean to you?
I think I have a pretty similar response. I mean, everything that I write, if I'm going to be interested in it enough to continue it more than a line, it has to involve some kind of inquiry. And for me, often it starts with language. It's a piece of language that kind of vibrates in my mind, that I feel some kind of potential there, and I don't know what that potential is. I often have no idea about subject matter, even that it's associated with. There's a piece of language that I find compelling and I don't understand why. And so I just kind of worry that piece of, it's a line, it's a sentence, something like that. And I kind of worry over it until it tells me what it wants to be. It suggests something else. And I kind of follow that inquiry of language to wherever it's going to lead. And then as that continues, I start to get a sense of a clear subject matter and a clearer kind of position toward the subject matter, a speaker, and those things start to emerge. And so as I learn about those things, then that raises new inquiries that can kind of come from it once I have firmer ground to be working from.
And does that language come from, you overhearing someone or reading something? Where does that, is there one source or is it multiple sources?
It's multiple. And for me, it's always the most important thing is to be receptive to that, because it can come from anywhere. Sometimes it's, a fragment of a sign that I see, or something overheard. Often it's something that I've read. Sometimes it's just, I have no idea where it comes from. A little piece of a sentence just gets stuck in my head. And that's always a good sign for me. When something gets stuck in my head, when it starts to rattle around in there, then I know that there's likely to be something. I kind of have learned to trust that intuition.
No, that's great. So Brittany, could you read a couple of poems for us, your work?
Sure. I'll start with a poem because I have family in the room, and this is a poem that has a mom appear in it. And I think my nephew might like this one. And this is the inquiry in this poem. This is a formal poem. It takes the shape of a ghazal. So if we don't know what that is, it just repeats a word at the end of each couplet of the poem. And so the question in this one really for me, I mean, the subject matter is interesting and fun, but the question for me really in this one is like, why would you need to repeat a phrase so many times, right? In a poem that takes this shape. And so you'll hear it, you'll hear the repetition. I should just say all of the poems in this book are called double portraits, and the inquiry in the book overall is about investigating what I on the page, the way an I on the page can stand in relationship to another you. So whether it's a you that is another person or a you that is an idea, the book is interested in the way the lyric I can sort of make that address. So many of the poems are these kinds of addresses to different people and different states of being. So this is a double portrait F00. Every year in various states, I get off the plane and look for my mother. On the other side of the security door, already waiting, is my mother. She's the kind of person who Windexes the table directly after dinner. I'm the kind of person who leaves the dinner plates dirty. I'm nothing like my mother. In her house, while I do my very best to be neat, she washes my clothes. In my house, because I can't be very neat for very long, I long for my mother. In her house, so that I'll sleep more easily, she makes my bed with her electric blanket. I sleep more easily because somewhere awake in the house is my mother. In my house, in order to sleep more easily, I sing a few lullabies. For this to work, I have to sing with the precise intonation of my mother. She can paint a portrait in oils and fix dinner from a can of mushroom soup. She can fix the dishwasher's plug drain and go for days without calling her mother. I can stay in bed for days without showering. I wear my bathing suit as underwear. What I cannot do is go for one day without calling my mother. On the phone, I'm likely to be grumpy, argumentative, dull, or silent. She'll often say cheerfully, life sucks, then you die, take it from your mother. We have this one thing in common. I think about myself almost all the time. She too thinks about me almost all the time. She says, because I'm your mother. When you have a kid, you'll understand. When are you having a kid? For the reasons above, I think it's better I never be anyone's mother. I know I better die before she does, but she says no, she'll never let that happen. I still somehow believe that the greatest power in the universe is my mother. When she's mildly annoyed or when I've been away for a long time, she calls me by my full name, Brittany Titania, which is the way of every mother. There are certain words you can never say too many times, especially when crying. Mommy, mama, mommy, mom. Where is my mother? I want my mother. So I was thrilled in that poem that at the end, I could actually say the word mother like many, many times, you know, in that last line, because in a poem like this, one of the great challenges is to like try to make the word interesting and necessary every time. And so you often don't want to use it many more times, but it just worked out that way. Like I did not have that ending in mind.
Oh, Brittany, one question. Since your mom is here, should we do some fact checking?
Yeah, it's not, well, some of it is factual.
Yeah, Lee, how much of that was totally made up and how much? No.
She's great with a can of mushroom soup, I'll tell you. My whole childhood, we could just like, you know, a meal out of that. She's great. I generally do not wear my bathing suit as underwear, however.
There we go. Okay, good. Now we're safe now. We're good.
And I did convert Peter to Windex.
Yeah, you did. So let's see what would go with that. This poem is in the same section of the book. The book is organized into 4 sections, and each section, I imagine like my dream for this book would be that a reader could encounter the poems on the wall of a gallery. And so each of the 4 sections would be a different room, and the reader could sort of walk through them and encounter them in any order. So the poems sort of bounce off each other, but they're not in sequence. They don't proceed in one direction. They're in series. So this is from the same series. So I'll read this too. You'll hear that this one too has a particular pattern of repetition, although it's not sort of codified in the way the ghazal form is. And you know, this collection as a whole is really interested in what patterning of language and what repetition can do for a reader in their ear and therefore like in their bodies and in their experience. Double portrait F30. Everyone's writing poems for the dead, those who have gone missing, those who have gone. Everyone's writing poems for the dead, even without meaning to, even unwillingly. We crack the brain's back door for children, for lovers, who set their door swinging, who come back, even unwillingly, to tell us something we think we hear in her singular smoker's voice when lately we believed in no voice but our own. We think we hear her beside us in the kitchen lifting our hair. See how we brought her home. See how she's brought her cigarette. We breathe in. The kitchen after this is predictably dark. Already the visitation is a memory. Already we suspect visitation is only memory, lighting the film in the chamber's dark. It's certainly a flash in our particular brain that captures our particular other, her hippocampal Polaroid exposed, no other way to certainly find her. Our pain brain recalled her momentarily, exactly. For a second, she was more ours than she ever really was, entirely ours. We go on recalling her consciously, inexactly, to keep her from going again. She who was, we'd like to believe it, telling us to say what we came to say. Don't go, you who've gone, you who were. So John, do you want me to keep going? Should I?
Oh, no, let's have Peter have a couple of turns at bat.
Okay. I'm going to read all new work here today. These first ones I'll be reading, maybe this will be all the ones I read, are from a series that I've been working on that kind of directly arise from the pandemic. I started to write these poems that specifically address the pandemic through basically comfort movies and television, the kind of movies and television that I was clinging to, especially in those longest, darkest days of being stuck at home, and thinking about the ways that movies that I watched since childhood, because that's really what I was gravitating towards, started to mean something a little different in the context of all of the trauma and separation. And we're just, even though they achieved that kind of comfort, they were still a little unsettling in certain ways. The themes that they made use of didn't kind of hit home the way that they may have before. And so I started to write poems to try to draw out some of those ideas. And the first one's called The Hobbit, that I'll be reading here. And this is one that picks up on a piece of text you're asking John about, kind of inspiration. Yep. This is maybe one of the more famous lines of The Hobbit, which is "there and back again." And that whole idea of kind of being able to go on an adventure and come back to where you came from, which is of course challenged in that book as well, seemed to be especially something to long for and something impossible because of what had been happening with the pandemic. So this is The Hobbit. There and back again. What could be simpler? Yes, the forest is bewildering. The beaches are strewn with wounds. The mountains collapse into radioactive ash. But the trip back always zips. Knowing is half the going. And home is a powerful gravity. So it's strange when tomorrow doesn't double back on yesterday. You're older, healed over, but that's not all of it. Pausing does nothing. Minute by slow minute, the line is zagging from the map. These are barbarian stars. The city on the horizon holds 10 million people, and none has swum in the river where your brother disappeared. No one wants to learn your word for grief.
Wow.
And the next one is from the same series. This one's maybe a little lighter, a little more ironic. This one's called The Next Generation, after the Star Trek series, and kind of plays on some of those themes, and also kind of touches on, I think, the way that we expect that we can engineer ourselves out of any kind of problem that we face, just as a kind of modern sensibility. And it maybe expresses some skepticism about that. This is The Next Generation. Hull breach, a battery of alarms, and the officers cheating the watch and life support failing. But not on this ship. Our captain dispenses right. Our breath is biofilter safe. Our shields are whole, even here, where the alien ship has foundered into the halo of a star in a tightening spiral. We are readying to assist. We've stockpiled bandages and phaser beams and backup plans. Our salvage crew is circling rare earths on the schematics. We have all the optimism of our major technological advantage.
How many TV shows did you watch during the,
A lot.
Oh man, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I watch a good amount of TV. Yeah, of course, I grew up in the Fred Flintstone, Three Stooges era. So there's a lot of material Yeah, I've got to write my Three Stooges, what do you call it? When you have them on an honor, an altar of honor or something, I've got to write a, yeah. My brothers wouldn't feel the same way because they were my practice dummies, but so Brittany, why don't you, why don't we do this, because we're kind of at a little mini break point. Emily, Lee, and Allison, we have a little segment where if you have comments for the poets or questions, you could ask them. We try to make it interactive. The whole idea is, you obviously you're here, you probably know the poets, but for a lot of people that are on our show, they don't know the poets. So there's a time for them to just ask a question or give a comment. So does anybody want to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you both for reading. Appreciate that. I'm curious, aside from, let's say, present company, who would you say are the poets you most like to read, or the poets that you gain sort of the most inspiration from?
Well, I can tell you who I'm reading right now. I mean, I always, there are a few poets that I always go back to and can read at any time, but it may be more interesting to hear about who I'm really interested in reading now, because that's, kind of I don't know, I feel always getting some contemporary poet recommendations out there is good because it's hard for people to find new poets sometimes. So I think Randall Mann is a poet that I would definitely read. He has a new and selected just out, but all of his books are great. And maybe Danez Smith is another one that I would read that I think is super interesting right now. What about you, P?
Right now, I'll answer it the same way, because I could certainly talk about Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Frost and Tom Gunn endlessly, but looking at more contemporary poets, I'm reading Linda Paston right now, who just recently passed away, actually, and who I'd never read before. I believe somebody posted one of her poems on Facebook after she had died, and I saw it on there and was kind of blown away. So I picked up her selected poems, and it's terrific. I would highly recommend it. It's really accessible and yet moving, and just really, really wonderful work. I'm also reading Moira Egan right now, who's a wonderful formally minded poet. A lot of sparkle in the lines, a lot of elegance. So I would recommend her as well. Yeah.
And Peter and Brittany, if you could put the names of those poets in the chat,
Sure.
so I could just grab them and put them in my little notebook that I keep. So Peter, let me switch gears and start with you this time. I know you teach writing. What do you I guess what's the number one rule or guidance for your students?
Oh, explore. Don't always go to what you know. I think especially in a workshop class where students are putting their work in front of others and feeling maybe some anxiety about wanting their work to be good enough and or represent themselves well. There's a tendency, I think, to be a little more conservative under those conditions, because people can be afraid to take risks, present a poem to the class that just doesn't work. But I think it's so important, I mean, for any poet, but especially for a young poet who's just learning, to try and fail, try things that they are not good at, don't know how to do, that seems totally different from their comfortable ways of working, and to just dive right into it and see what happens. Because I think, so much more interesting work can come from that. And also it's just the best way to learn, is by, getting right out of your comfort zone into something strange.
And most of the courses you teach, are they required or electives?
I teach both. It depends. I teach both majors and non-majors depending on the semester, and so some of the non-major courses fulfill distribution requirements at the university. Some of the Majors courses are required for the major. So
Yeah.
some students just take them because they're interested in them. They don't fulfill any requirements necessarily.
Yeah. Great. So Brittany, what would you be your guidance for your students or instructions?
Well, it actually works out well for this subject because I always am telling them to write toward their questions. And especially, I think I teach poetry, I teach general creativity classes, I teach nonfiction. And especially, I think when I'm teaching poetry and essay writing, I'm always telling them write toward your questions. I mean, I think that's kind of like, and I think that's like the sort of very similar answer to Peter's, which is, like experimentation, openness, writing toward not certainty, but toward like into the things that you don't know. Like it's the only interesting thing to do. Otherwise it's super boring for you and probably for your reader.
So you teach a course on creativity?
I do, yeah. And on developing a creative practice. Essentially the class is about, we experiment sort of broadly in all kinds of genres and try out, lots of different ways of writing, but the idea is really about like developing a sustaining creative practice that might feel good if you keep that practice going in your life, right? I mean, many of my students, where I teach at Stanford, most of my students are not humanities. They don't self-label as like humanities people. Only 12% of them graduate with any humanities degree at all. And so, but creative writing is the biggest minor on campus because they're looking for something, for this other way of being. And so I'm interested in like the way that they might, like have this experience in 10 weeks with each other and with me, and then, remember that they have that in their lives, right? Like that's something that they can do even if they're going to work for Google next year, and I hope for them to make space for that in their lives. Because I actually think it's important it's so important to my students. Like they want to be there. They want to have this experience. I think everyone wants to have this experience in some way, whether it's with writing or with like another form of art and expression. Like there's, we're built for that as humans. So.
And what are the two big majors at Stanford? Would it be engineering and then something else?
It's computer science and something with an acronym that I can never remember. That's like another offshoot of like a sciencey kind of thing, but a little softer. But I can't tell you. Like forget what it's called.
Bio, maybe.
Yeah, maybe it's hum bio. Yeah.
It's pre-med.
It's like a pre-med track. Yeah.
I was going to say, is it a drug? Is it a class? Is it a?
Yeah, I never know, John.
So Brittany, why don't you share some more of your work with us, please?
All right, I'll read a couple more here. Let's see. Okay. This poem, I'll just read one because this poem is a little bit longer, but it really goes with the theme of inquiry here. And this is a poem that's built on syntax and on the phrase blank people. So you may have, we fill in that phrase all the time. Like you may have heard young people or white people or, like queer people, right? Like we're filling in that phrase and we're used to hearing that phrase. So in the poem looks sort of like a Mad Lib in which there's a blank before people every time. And so I'm going to pause when that blank happens. And then I'll tell you a little bit about it afterwards. Double portrait, WOR 99. People are people. Restaurants should hire people for the front of the house and people for the back of the house. Restaurants do not have a history of hiring people for the front of the house and people for the back of the house. Apple should hire people. Google should hire people. Facebook should hire people. How much do people know? How much do people know? Law firms should hire people. Salons should hire people. Universities should hire people. Law firms, salons, universities do not have a history of equally hiring people. No place has a history of hiring people. What if many places, most places, all places hired people? Yes, all places. In this land, people do not have jobs. What if People wanting jobs could get jobs. Yes, people. People use language. People give their children certain languages. People give their children uncertain languages too. People have received language, certain and uncertain. Certain gifts are especially risky, but what other gifts do people have? People use language to construct certain phrases. People is a risky phrase to risk constructing. To begin a sentence with the phrase, people is riskier still. People use language to construct certain phrases to begin certain grammatical sentences. People use certain adjective plus noun phrases to begin certain grammatical sentences. In this land, people may use certain adjective plus noun phrases, and people are allowed to follow certain adjective plus noun phrases with any combination of verb, adverb, prepositional phrase, direct object, indirect object, in order to make certain grammatical sentences. This is not true for people at all times or for people at this time. This is not true for people in all lands or for people in this land. In this land, people may follow certain adjective plus noun phrases with any combination of verb, prepositional phrase, direct object, indirect object to make certain grammatical generalizations. But for people, this is a risky matter. Generalization about people is a risky matter. Generalization by people is an especially risky matter. There are consequences for people. Yes, for people. To talk about this is a risky matter. Not to talk about this is an especially risky matter. Are people aware of this? For people, being aware is especially complicated, yes, especially risky. People must consider their relationship to grammar. For people, certain grammatical constructions lead to certain sentences. People give their children certain grammatical constructions that lead to certain sentences. Certain sentences last a lifetime. People have a certain responsibility to languages, phrases, sentences, grammars, generalizations. People have a certain history with languages, phrases, sentences, grammars, generalizations, and for people, this is especially complicated. For people, responsibility is especially complicated. Yes, for people. Taking responsibility might be the most important task for people in this land at this time and all lands at all times. How do you see yourself fitting into the phrase people? How do you see me fitting into the phrase people? How do I see myself fitting into the phrase people? People fill in the phrase in certain and uncertain ways. People are doing it now. People have a responsibility. For people, filling in and following this phrase with a sentence is especially complicated. Yes, especially complicated. The sentence following will be a sentencing of people, a sentencing of people in all lands at all times. Yes, a long sentence in all lands at all times. We're about to begin. So thanks for listening. That one's a little bit longer, and it's, yeah, I can try to hold up a page here so that you can kind of see it. Can we see? I can't tell. Can you see what it looks like?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it looks like a Mad Lib. And, I was interested in this one in figuring out what does a certain syntactical construction push us into saying, right? Does syntax and the way that we set up certain phrases and certain ways of speaking, does that, and how does that affect the thing that we say next? So that's what the poem is sort of interested in exploring, and especially around these topics that we have to talk about, I wanted the poem to be participatory in that way so that, we're all sort of thinking about this together at the same time.
Hey, hold on one second. I got to show you. Yeah, go ahead. Peter, why don't you read one or two?
Okay. I'm going to keep reading some of these pandemic features. This next one is Robinsonade. A Robinsonade is a kind of genre based on Robinson Crusoe, which is basically a shipwreck genre, or a genre really where somebody's been thrown out of their ordinary world into some alternate existence. And often in these kind of stories, think Alice in Wonderland, You can think of a story like The Wizard of Oz, which works much the same way. People find their way back at the end. So it's a comforting kind of genre. It's, something crazy happens, your life changes, and then you kind of find your way back at the end. So in that sense, it has something in common with the Hobbit poem as well. So this one is called Robinsonade. You can't seek out that other world. It won't be found by snaking rabbit holes or barging into wardrobes. Likewise, taking your little dog for a walk down Tornado Alley, or threading shoals at full sail on a starless night while the captain's stoned. These are obvious attempts at pandering to fate, and fate is a permanent loner. But look, late again, hurrying back to work, full of an overpriced lunch and the stock's new highs. You cut through the random crush and fevered waiting behind the station. You leap from the middle streetcar stair and land in a place of testing. And this next one is called Star Wars, one of my favorites movies growing up, probably still. And this one takes the idea of COVID as a kind of imperial presence in its way, but hopefully, like all of these poems, it's also kind of destabilizing those stories as well. So this is Star Wars. Mostly, the invaders don't come. Life is hard because life is hard, especially here in the desert provinces. The suns never go down, then the suns never come up. Everything is the color of work. The gruel is seasoned with grit. But I do have family. I mean, we have each other. Family is the meaning of life. That is the reason for work. When I need to roam, they tell me to stay. When I need to die, they tell me to live. That's what a family does. Someday, I'll do the same, perhaps, if I can have one of my own. Like anyone, I want what can't be taken from me. I thought I knew the invaders. I'd heard they masked their faces and announced themselves with explosions. I'd heard the only danger was resistance. I'd seen the clips of interstellar cruisers spiked with cannons. Their purpose was unmistakable. Their trouble was for others. When my father knocked at the door and kissed my cheek and came inside and shared his mind, he wore his own face.
Ooh. So how much TV watching was there during the pandemic? It seems like but there's a book of like 400 poems or something that are.
I think there's about 30.
30?
So, yeah, but that's usually television watching yields nothing. And so in this case, I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. Brittany, what are you working on now in terms of your poetry?
I'm actually not writing poems. I'm writing a memoir that I'm almost finished with. So I'm working on prose. I have, a few poems sort of kicking around. But I just, after my last book, I just wasn't that interested in the line anymore. I was interested in the sentence, and I was writing this thing that I knew had to be built in sentences. So it's prose. So we'll see, John. I'll let you know. Keep you posted. I'll keep you posted.
And is it a self-memoir or a memoir of someone else?
No, it is. It begins with my father's death at the beginning of the piece, and we had been estranged for 15 years before that. And so like, you know, like the poems, it's sort of interested in sorting out that relationship and thinking about that relationship. It's also, you know, I would say using that relationship as a way to think about memory and the way that we all possess these kinds of composite memories based on the things that, you know, we've been told by others about our experiences, the things that we have, you know, heard about our experiences, the things that we've told ourselves about our experiences in order to make like a solid personal history and live in the world. And so we're all in possession of these many kinds of memory at one time. We don't have a sort of solid personal history, you know, as much as we would like to think we do. So the book is really interested in investigating that, but it does so through the sort of means of this relationship that, you know, I had and didn't have with my father before he died.
And how do you know when the book is going to be complete?
It's a good question. I mean, it's taken me, I wrote it, you know, I started it many years ago and I didn't, you know, I thought I was writing these sort of like standalone essays and, you know, I wasn't conceptualizing it as a book. I didn't know, you know, first of all, felt like I had no business writing a book of prose. I didn't know how to do it. I had to learn how to do it. So, you know, I actually think that I have a draft that's done now. And I think I'm pretty much there, John. And mostly it's because like I can see what the book is, you know. At first I was, you know, working with, you know, as we were talking about, like all the sort of questions I have, but like by the end of the process, I was working with like, what does the book want to be and how am I going to make a complete book? And I think that's what I've sort of figured out. So I think I'm pretty much there.
Great, fantastic. Peter, how about you? You talked about the beginning of the show that you were, you know, working on a new poetry book.
Yeah, I think that's just about done as well. I'm still working on revisions now, but I think the vast majority of the poems that are going to be in the book are written and they're in there. And so now I'm kind of learning to shape the book. It's been through a couple drafts now, and I think getting closer to what it will be. Yeah, into that kind of final part of the process. It's a part of the process I'm in some ways less comfortable with. I love generating. There's something so exciting about, especially when it's going well, kind of following out new work. There's a kind of energy and excitement that comes with that. But you have to do this other part too. It's first of all, just to get the poems really, really finished. Make sure that they're, you know, there's nothing there that's a kind of you know, false solution that kind of stuck around through a number of drafts. You have to kind of find your way into those and make sure everything is perfect, but then also putting it into the right ordering and arrangement so that it can best reach the reader. And I feel a little less comfortable with those kind of parts of the process, but like I said, I think they're really important to how a reader will experience the work. So that's what I'm in right now, and I'll be hoping to send this off for publication very soon.
And what is the shaping, just for, you know, I've heard probably different renditions of it. What does the shaping mean? Is it a word? Is it a sentence, a section? What is the,
yeah, I think it's
how does that arrive for you?
Yeah, a couple of those things. One, you know, this book will not be a kind of tightly bound project book like my last book was. My last book's called Mirror Forms, and that one is all poems written in the same little form. It's kind of like a sonnet, but a form I invented, a little smaller than a sonnet. So this one doesn't have that kind of unifying principle. So part of the process is just making sure there is a unified feel to the book. In this particular instance, about half the poems are going to be these pandemic features. And so that's a large portion of the book, but it's also only half the book. And so I'm thinking about how to best steer the reader through those different impulses, some of which are these you know, movie-based poems and some of which are not, and trying to figure out how they work together and you know, can build upon each other and complement each other. So some of both.
Nice, nice. Yeah, Brittany, why don't you just share? I know you're writing your prose thing, but I'm always interested in this. Yeah, I've started to do a little writing myself, and I'm a CFO guy, so I'm a math guy. So I'll just tell you, that numbers are my language and words are like, okay, words. Where do I find a bunch of words to put down? But how does the shaping work for you, Brittany? How does that, do you wait till you finish, a poem or a chapter, and then at some point you decide to revisit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has sort of worked like that it certainly works like that for a poetry manuscript, that you sort of get this critical mass of poems, and then you sort of can start to see what the book is going to be or how the book is going to work. And so then, the order probably changes a bunch of times, and you're sort of like working with the material still and trying to sort out what the book is. When I first wrote Double Portrait, all of the poems were titled Double Portrait. And then I had a friend of mine who's a great reader for me, and she said, you can't have every poem titled Double Portrait because it's just oppressive for the reader. They cannot encounter it that often. And she was so right. I mean, it was completely true. And I also realized the reason why I had done that is I didn't want to sort of make the book a sequence in which the reader would feel compelled to read, front to back, as we're like sort of in the tyranny of like the book shape. I wanted the reader to feel like they had more freedom within the collection. So I didn't want a numbering system. I didn't want them to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I had to figure out like something that would hold the poems in the way that I wanted the reader to experience it. And so that's how I started thinking about, in these 4 sort of series, how are the poems going to refract off of each other? Could a reader experience them in multiple orders? And how would I make that experience happen for the reader? With the prose book, it's a little bit similar in that, I really didn't write a book in which I was writing chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3. It's not that way. Because of my background as a poet and because of what I knew how to do, I was writing individual pieces. And then at the end, I had to figure out how I was going to put them together to make a book. And so the process was similar in that way.
Great. I will once again encourage Emily, Lee, and Allison, if you have a question or a comment. I always say, don't let the poets off easy. This is where you can make them sweat. Only kidding. Anybody? Allison? Emily? You don't have to. It's just an opportunity. Sometimes we have these long conversations with the gallery. So very nice. So
I can ask another if no one else wants to.
No, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sort of curious, like when you do get stuck or if you're not feeling inspired, like is it easier to go within a form, like you pick a syncane or whatever and work on that? Or is it easier or do you find yourself just like writing, putting words down, and then like, is there a way that you find that like works for you to get out of a rut or a funk or whatever you want to call it?
I love going toward form. Yeah. And I think, both Peter and I are formally minded poets anyway. Peter perhaps even more so than I am, so he can probably talk about this a little bit more. But I think, going toward something that already exists is easier than reinventing the wheel. You know what I mean? Like, it's something that I always tell my students too, because like, if you start with a form, like a form has certain sets of questions. It has, right? Like, and it has certain things that you can move toward. It has a certain way of being. Like, if you're thinking about like a poem that might be like two-halved and that might have this like weird relationship between like the 2 ideas in it, you might go toward a sonnet because that sort of exists in a sonnet, right? And then you have some sort of boundaries to at least work with. It doesn't necessarily always mean for me that the poem will end up in that form, but I think it is a great way of getting like unstuck, or like, like to start something when there's nothing there. I think, there's like impossible to wait around for inspiration because you like wait forever. At least I would just like sit there miserably forever. So I think it's like, you have to find something. P, do you want to?
Yeah. What's your super sauce on that one?
For me, I sit there miserably forever. That's the only way I know how to do it. Sometimes that involves writing some false starts that I know aren't going anywhere, just to kind of get the pen moving. And so I stop staring at the page. But it doesn't really work for me to say I have a piece of language in front of me. If it doesn't tell me that it needs to be in a form of some kind, I probably can't force it into it. It doesn't work that way for me. I kind of know when things are moving towards form. I suppose for certain kinds of form, I have those ideas in mind when I'm starting, but I know something about the language that will lead into those forms, but I can't just take a kind of piece of language and make it into a form in that way. I really have to sit there and wait until it tells me what it is and what's coming next. And so what I do is I take a walk. I put it aside for a little while, or I just sit there and stare at it for a while, and it can be frustrating. But I know now from experience that even sitting that extra hour with it will often yield something, even when it seems completely frustrating and like a total waste of time for the first hour when I've sat there and written absolutely not a word. But I just have to kind of wait it out and trust that something will eventually come. And it all comes from that first impulse where I know that there's something in that piece of language to begin with, and that's what I'm kind of setting in front of me, and I just have to wait there until it tells me where to go. So
Yeah, I find it amazing that poets refer to poems like in the third person, like there's another person in the room that you can't fit into a box, that you can't make turn into a sonnet or something. I just love that how poems have this identity, and that I don't know if you're negotiating with them or arguing with them or
sometimes both. Yeah.
So Peter, we only have a few more minutes left. So why don't you both, read maybe one more poem?
Sure.
Peter, why don't you go ahead since you're on the big screen here?
Okay. This one is called Disaster Movie. And I think there is a movie of that name, which is not what I mean. I mean more the genre, because I actually haven't seen, I think The Rock is in that one maybe, but it probably draws on it, since those movies are basically all the same. It probably works either way. So this is Disaster Movie. Start with a city, then explode it. But not just any city. A made-up megalopolis, however lovely its toppling monuments, won't do. Nor will any no-name city of the heartland with its standard issue girdle of bypasses. The point is real, identifiable suffering. A father-daughter dangling from the Eiffel lattice, long shot of the plunge. Plague faces oozing into the Capitol lawn. The president herself mounting the podium to give a rallying address, devoured by a cyclone cloud of vengeful locusts. Then the strange beauty of the blasted field, deurbanized, now suddenly anywhere. And the chance to build again, this time more fairly and more nobly. Our hero angles into the fleshy smoke like a conquering atom.
Nice. Yeah, I think you ought to publish Peter's top 10, like disaster movies or sci-fi movies or something. I think your students next semester, that'll be their whole thing, right? You got to write the Star Wars thing, the disaster thing, no, it's all fun, all fun. Thank you very much. Brittany, how about you?
Sure, I'll read one more. I'll close with one that sort of has traction with the nonfiction book that I was talking about, because it addresses a father subject. This one also has the particular kind of repetition you heard in the first poem that I've read. Double Portrait F10. Today I'm not vomiting blood. Tomorrow I could be vomiting blood. It can happen after a sword fight or a sound night's sleep. You make coffee and boom, you're vomiting blood. You don't need a doctor to tell you it's bad news to be vomiting blood. I've seen all the second to last scenes in which the villain or tragic hero is vomiting blood. It doesn't matter how I feel or felt about someone once he's vomiting blood. This is how I know the villain and the tragic hero are the same man. He's the one vomiting blood. Tonight, with my warm feelings, I try to keep him alive, thinking from far away, no more vomiting blood. It's time to say I love you and mean it to the man who's vomiting blood. Now I'm afraid it's almost over. I'm afraid. Who stays living for long after vomiting blood? I love you. I mean it. A daughter should be holding the bin to catch your vomit and your blood.
Woo.
Yeah, sorry, it's kind of a downer, that one.
Yeah, I was
should've
gonna
done
say,
something
I'm,
a little cheerier. I was thinking
think
of like the Peter's poems, and I was thinking, oh, this one has the sort of like hero in it, and the, but that was a kind of a bummer way to end. But sorry, John.
yeah, we're watching New Amsterdam and then the reruns and then Chicago Med or The Good Doctor. I'm always amazed by how it all works out on TV, even if you're vomiting blood.
Yep.
Listen, we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank you two so much. It's a real blessing for us to have both of you on the show. Normally we have people flying solo, so it's nice to have the back and forth between two poets who know each other pretty well. So, no, thank you, Emily, Miss Halls. Good luck. Geometry is very important. Forget poetry, geometry. And Allison, thank you. And Lee, thank you for joining in. And Peter and Brittany will get you the recording very soon.
All right. Thanks so much, John.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
John.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Miss you.